Blessings, beloveds. Anastasia with you today, Cosmic Astrologer. Thank you for tuning into my channel again. Alright, I'm going to talk about Saturn today, and the main reason is because Saturn is going to change signs, as many of you are probably aware, and Saturn is going to move into its natural sign, which is Capricorn. Saturn rules Capricorn. It also rules Aquarius, but when we look at Aquarius, we also associate the planet Uranus. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what Saturn, I guess, means in Capricorn in terms of a generic, I suppose, outlook. In terms of what is that going to look like, feel like over the next 2.5 years for all of us. So Saturn in Capricorn is a collective experience, but of course what we need to do is we need to look at, well, where is Capricorn located in our birth chart? Okay, so a lot of the general sort of statements that are made in terms of forecasting, I would call it, is a very general overview of the potential energies emerging through any particular planet and any particular sign it's in. So there's a collective experience of it, but in order to personalize any of the planetary energies and movements, you always need to refer back to your birth chart. It's as simple as that. So you can watch a whole video that could go for 3 hours that talks about Saturn in Capricorn, and yes, you'll get a general overview of what that kind of energy brings. But unless you know, first of all, where Capricorn is in your birth chart, therefore where transiting Saturn will be located over the next 2.5 years. That could be in one house, it could be in 2 houses, because you could have the sign Capricorn overlapping houses. So half of the sign of Capricorn is one house and the other half of the sign is in another house. So these are things that you need to be paying attention to. Okay, so what I want to first start talking about is, before we go into Saturn in Capricorn, which will take place basically, begins on the 21st of December, which is a pretty interesting time as well in terms of energy shifting and solstices and things like that taking place. And it's going to be in Capricorn until the end of December 2020. So it's a 2.5 year period or thereabouts, which is the case of Saturn's cycle through the signs. It generally spends about 2.5 years in each sign. Okay, Saturn's cycle is 29 years, 29.5 thereabouts, as most of you are aware. So for those of you born in 29 years ago, you'll be having your Saturn return now, which is a very, very significant passageway in your life. What I might do actually is, first of all, I just want to talk about Saturn in terms of its generic cycle, okay? That meaning that its cycle is applicable to every single human being on this planet, okay? So we're all born with Saturn in our chart. We all have a Saturn return. We all have a second Saturn return. And then we have all these in-between cycles, which basically run every 7 years. Okay, now just to give you an idea of what I mean about that, first of all, let's identify and recognize that, yes, Saturn in Capricorn is in rulership. So it's in its prime position, okay? There's no question about that. But what we must understand is that Saturn is an inherently malefic planet. Okay, now the term malefic comes from traditional astrology. Malefic, benefic. So benefic is a planet that offers abundance, if you like, and a malefic planet is essentially what brings up malefic situations, so not very pleasant situations. So Saturn has an inherent malefic nature. There is no Saturn transit, if you like, that is a feel-good transit, okay? I'm not suggesting it doesn't produce results. In fact, Saturn transits can produce some of the most powerful and most meaningful results in your life, depending on how you are working with the energy, how aware you are. Because every single planetary energy will be projected externally until it is integrated. That's the fundamental law. So Saturn is a malefic, as I said. It has a 29-year cycle, and it's our first encounter with Saturn energy is when we are born. Okay, so the moment we leave that warm, moist womb, which is where we are nurtured and protected and feeling a sense of oneness with our mother, our physical mother, that moment that we are born, there's the first encounter, the first emergence, the first experience of separation begins. And that is the very first experience of Saturn energy. Okay, so it is Saturn that gives the feeling or sensation that we are separate from others. And there is a need for that, there is a place for that, because if we didn't have that understanding that I am separate from you and you are separate from so-and-so, it would be pretty weird, wouldn't it? We'd think that we were all physically one. Now, we may all be one in spirit, in divine consciousness, of course, but in terms of our physical body, we are all separate beings, okay? We all come from the one source and choose to incarnate into a particular body, and that means a particular family, a particular country, etc., etc. So the first experience of Saturn, which is separation, is the time we are born, okay? Now, Saturn's generic cycle, and grab a pen and paper, because you will need this if you're not aware of these particular ages in terms of Saturn's generic cycle and how significant this is. So as I said, the first encounter is birth, okay? So the first 7 years of life are really the most formative on a developmental level, on all developmental levels actually, so physically, psychologically, emotionally. Something really prominent and significant is set up in our psyche. So certain psychological templates and core beliefs about ourselves and about life, and about our family and people starts to get a foundation begins. A foundation is created. So, the Buddhists say, show me a 7-year-old boy and I'll show you the man. So think about that. Okay, so the first 7 years, in terms of Saturn, it is the separation of being in the womb, as I said, and then it is the encounter of this reality. And Saturn rules reality, but when I say reality, because there are many realities, okay, but in terms of this 3D earthly dimension, this particular reality is ruled by Saturn, which is why this reality is actually so harsh on so many different levels. Now, yes, there are beautiful aspects to this life and this experience, and there is love, and there is joy, and there is play, and there's expression, and there's creativity, and there's everything in the mix. But nevertheless, this reality has a lot of cruel, harsh elements to it that basically create a lot of suffering for people. and the primary suffering comes from the mind, because it is our perspective or our thought on a particular thing that will create our state of how we feel, whether we will suffer as a result or whether we will feel okay, right? Okay, so 0 to 7 is the first encounter of that 7-year cycle. Saturn rules the bones, it rules the skeletal system, by the way, and it also rules the skin on the body. Okay, now that's a very interesting point to understand, because the skin is where our body, this physical body, begins and ends, if you like. Okay, so that's why Saturn rules boundaries and structure and form and so forth. Now, from the age of 7 to 14, we have another 7-year cycle. So age 7 is really primal, really critical in a little child's life. Okay, just to give you an example, it's when the kid goes to school, for instance. It's their first encounter of the outer world on that level, engaging with other little people around them and having a teacher in the classroom, so an authority figure. Apart from the authority figures, which are their parents, their first encounter of an authority figure is the school environment and their teacher and so forth. Saturn rules authority figures, it rules structure, routine, etc. Okay, so then when this kid turns 14, 14 is a really important passageway in a person's life. I don't need to explain why, I'm pretty sure you're all aware of it, okay? The next important passageway is at 21, so that's 7 years later. All these ages that I'm actually indicating to you are all related to Saturn's generic cycle. It runs through every 7 years. So in other words, from the time you're born, Saturn's location every 7 years and where it has moved to in your birth chart is going to reveal to you the adjustments, the restructure, the letting go of stuff, the growing, the developing, the self-development, the frustrations, the limitations, the fears, all those things will come up every 7 years, and that will show up in wherever Saturn is transiting in your chart, okay? So 7, 14, 21, 29. 29 is the first Saturn return. Most of you are aware of that. The first Saturn return is a real, a very important passageway, because it is when the true adult steps forward within us. We're forced to. It's kind of like we don't have a choice, really. So Saturn sets up these conditions where we are forced to take responsibility for our life and whatever that life is, all the various components in our life. So the first Saturn return is usually quite a challenging period for most people, and naturally that will be reflected through the person's Saturn in their natal chart and what sign it's in, what house it's in, and what aspects it has. Sorry, I live on quite a busy intersection. There's just a lot of, I think we've got a lot of fires going on. We're right in a really hot period at the moment, and yeah, fire engines are all over the place, and I hope people are okay. Anyway, okay, so yeah, 29, Saturn return, major time in a person's life. Essentially what's going to happen is that it's very common for people to leave a marriage, leave a relationship, relocate, start a new career, start a new job. These sort of external frames of our life that I suppose help us understand where we are in life right now and how we are developing and what we are achieving and what do we want to do. So it's the whole individuation process, as Carl Jung coined, that is seen through Saturn's generic cycle. By the way, I didn't mention Saturn rules the teeth as well. And, you know, at the age of 7, which is the first critical 7-year period of the first 7-year experience of Saturn, that's when our second set of teeth come out as well. So, you know, it's pretty interesting. There's no coincidence there. Okay, so at 29, whatever decisions we make, in short, are going to really be affecting how our life manifests over the next 7 years. So when we're 35, in other words, we're going to see the results, good or bad, based on the decisions we made when we were 29. So these are really important passageways. Okay, so 29, Saturn return. Pardon me. 35, we see the fruits and results to our actions when we were 29. 42, similar thing again. We go through an adjustment period, and it's kind of like the midlife crisis. It's in psychological terms, or in general terms, we know that the 40s are generally the midlife crisis. Well, that's a Saturnian experience again. That's Saturn doing its thing, moving around the zodiac, and making a very strong statement every 7 years. The statement being its point of reevaluation, readjustment, restructure, removing what no longer serves you, recognizing where you may need to work harder, or what sort of foundations you've built, and perhaps what foundations you need to remove. It's a real earthy energy and experience, and because it has all these components to it relating to structure, order, frustration, limitation, fear of failure is Saturn, actually. So when you see an individual who is compulsively driven to be successful, they've usually got quite a strong Saturn in their chart, perhaps Saturn in the 10th house, or perhaps they're a Capricorn, or perhaps they've got Sun conjunct Saturn, and so forth. The next important passageway is at around about the age of 50, and then again we have a second Saturn return between the ages of 58 to 60. So again, another important time. It's the second Saturn return. We've lived almost 60 years at this point, and we're at a point where it's kind of like looking through a filter and just looking through your whole life up until that point, and identifying and recognizing what you have built. And again, this is now a major chapter of a new beginning again in your life. So anyway, it keeps going. So then we have another Saturn 7-year cycle experience at around about the age of 66, and then again at about 73, and then again at about 81, and then finally we have our third full Saturn return between the ages of 89 and 90. Now, the years or ages that I just named will vary. When I say vary, what I mean is this. So your Saturn return will be, it could kick in from about the age of 28 at times, and you could experience it sort of, it's when I say kick in, it's like Saturn is starting to get close to its actual natal position. So the energy of that Saturn return begins prior to the actual exact hit of when Saturn returns to its actual location in degrees and minutes. So 6 months either side, 8 months either side of the years that I have specified. Keep that in mind, because when Saturn is in its retrograde cycle, it's going to move slower and faster at different periods through different signs in different years. Okay, so just keep that in mind as well. So that is Saturn's generic cycle, and it's a really interesting cycle to observe. This idea of every 7 years. Now, I'm sure you've all heard, when people have been in a marriage or relationship for 7 years, the whole expression 7-year itch, this is where it comes from. It comes from this individuation process of Saturn, the psychological template of Saturn through its generic cycle. And I just forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, I'll move on to my next parts of this talk. So before I go into Saturn in Capricorn and what that is going to look like for a lot of us, just some other things I want to mention relating to Saturn's cycle. So Saturn essentially is it's what we view as our maturity, achievement and development process in life. It's what enables us to mature and to achieve things in life, but with a lot of effort and a lot of hard work. Nothing comes easy with Saturn. Nothing. Can I be more clear? So anytime Saturn is doing something to your chart, wherever it's traveling, it is implying that this part of your life needs reassessment, it needs reevaluation, it needs some restructure. So, very serious attention must be given to this area of your life. Now, there's often a lot of resistance that comes up with that because, people essentially don't like change. I've said this before, we're creatures of habit. And Saturn doesn't come along and bring, blessings and opportunities in little gift boxes and go, oh, there you go, have that and enjoy. It actually comes in with some, really challenging psychological struggles that we project out there into our experiences in the environment, workplace, relationships, families, etc. So, Saturn is okay, so yes, perhaps I should talk about that now. What I wanted to mention to you guys is, actually before I go into that, I just want to give you some keywords for Saturn. You've probably heard these before, maybe you haven't heard some, I don't know. But Saturn is the ruler of time as well, by the way. Saturn is Chronos in the Greek language. I am Greek, by the way, so it's quite useful actually for my astrological, mythological understanding. So Chronos means time, literally. So Saturn is the lord of time. He's the timekeeper, okay? Hence this generic cycle that I just went through with you from birth up until the age of 90. That is it's a very specific time and very specific ages, isn't it, which runs through every 7 years. So when you're having a Saturn transit, it's going to mean that whatever you're working on at this point in your life relating to Saturn stuff, it requires patience, perseverance, effort, and time. Nothing moves quickly with Saturn. It's a slow labor of love, if you could call it that. So it's a lot of work. So as I said before, Saturn rules reality, right? Meaning this 3D reality. And the downside about a strong Saturn in that sense is that Saturn, for a person who's very Saturnian, to them, this is it. This is the only reality. We've already got one shot and this is it. I'm sure you've met people like that who believe that, think that, feel that. I'm not saying they're wrong or right, I'm just pointing out the differences in people. So when you have that strong Saturnian energy and this is your reality and this is it, it's to the exclusion of all other possible realities. And that's, in my opinion, a downside to Saturn. So getting back to the key words, so all authority figures are ruled by Saturn, including the first being your parents as you grew up, because they are essentially authority figures when you're a little kid. They give you the rules, they tell you what you can do and what you can't do. And, you know, when we make that transition from leaving the nest and, you know, finding our own path and way in life, well, then we start to project the Saturn onto the world out there, hence why we start to then identify and relate to all the rules and norms and regulations that are posed through government bodies, etc., etc. You know, for some people, that's a natural order of things and they follow that quite comfortably. And for those who are, you know, more Aquarian, Uranian, Sagittarian, Scorpio, Plutonian, yeah, they're not really going to be, you know, very comfortable with rules and regulations and all that bullshit just posed on them. So these are going to be the rebels, you know, and Aries. Oh, how could I leave out Aries? I'm Aries, and Aries as well. Okay, so hard work, effort, ambition, structure, form, limitations, boundaries, rules, respect, leadership, teachers, all those sorts of ambition, drive, success. You know, it's if you can, you know, those mountain goats. Have you seen those mountain goats when they're on those incredible mountains and the way they climb up that mountain, which it's really freaky if you see it. It's quite amazing actually. Well, that's Capricorn. You know, in the traditional esoteric level, Capricorn, when it's operating at its most healthiest functional level and has that sense of humility and compassion, which Capricorn often doesn't, but when it does operate from that sphere, what it is it's the sign of incredible leadership and wisdom that leads the people to a higher level of existence, consciousness, experience, etc. And when we bring that down to this 3D sort of level, then we're talking about the person who's very successful on that social level and professional level. You know, Saturn rules magicians in esoteric astrology. So alchemy, you know, that's ruled by Saturn. So Saturn is not all bad, as it were. But in terms of this 3D reality, this physical experience, we have to undergo this developmental process, which involves psychological, emotional, and physical dimensions that we just cannot avoid. And it's painful, because it's painful to be born. Is it not painful to be born? Have you ever heard of or seen a baby come out, you know, dancing and laughing? No, it's, in most cases they're screaming or they might just be mute. But anyway, so that's the first initial feeling of separation and the feeling of being cold, because Saturn has a very cold energy. So when it's lacking that humility and compassion, Saturn is very cruel, hard and cold. So when we're going through these really hard, cold sort of lessons, that's Saturn. It's nothing else. It's just Saturn. So that actually follows through onto something else that I want to bring to your attention, which is really interesting. This comes from, you could say, medieval astrology, essentially, or you could say traditional astrology. So another thing to observe in your own chart is where, in terms of hemispheres. So because Saturn is a malefic planet and it's cold and dry in nature, it's going to benefit the most when it's in the same hemisphere as the Sun. So if you can imagine a birth chart and the horizon, so Okay, just to put it very simply. So that's one horizon, well, that's above the horizon, I should say, and that's below the horizon. So that's one hemisphere and that's another hemisphere. So if you had the sun down here and you had Saturn down here, that would be pretty good. Okay, I'll tell you why in a moment. If, however, you had the sun here and you had Saturn up here and the moon up here with Saturn, what Saturn does when it's not in the same hemisphere as the sun, it'll bring up its more malefic nature, because the sun's heat and vibration essentially warms up that cold, dry nature of Saturn. So when you've got Sun and Saturn in the same hemisphere, Saturn benefits. When you've got Saturn in the same hemisphere as the moon, then what happens is the process of your decision making in life, generally throughout your entire life, is very much colored by the moon. So your decision making is very much based on your emotions, okay, and that can be a problem at times, because the moon is a feminine principle and quality, and it's moist in nature, whereas Saturn is dry. So it's moist and wet, and Saturn is dry and cold. So Saturn doesn't benefit by being near the moon. The moon actually probably misses out. But when you're putting Saturn in the same hemisphere as the sun heats up that dry, coldness of Saturn. So its inherent malefic nature is somewhat lessened, you could say. That's just a little tip for you. You will not get that from just general popular astrology books, because this is medieval astrology. Okay. The name for that, by the way, that position for when Saturn is in the same hemisphere as the sun, the implication is that it's what's called insect. When a planet is insect, it operates better. Don't like to use simple words like that. It produces the most results. You know, when a planet is insect. When it's out of sect, there's some problems. That's a whole other area of astrology. Perhaps I'll do some videos on some medieval stuff. I studied medieval astrology many moons ago, and it's a very different way of looking at a lot of components of astrology, but there's a lot of value in it. Okay, so just getting back to, now I've given you some keywords for Saturn. Now, just remember, you know, Saturn is a malefic. Its inherent nature is malefic. And think back to the myth. I don't know if you've read the myth, but if you haven't, you need to read it. Because that tells you everything about the nature of Saturn, what you need to understand from that psychological level. But in short, Saturn ate his own children. He ate 5 out of his 6 children as soon as they were born. Why did he do that? Because he feared that they would overthrow him, his rulership. So this is a sort of paranoia and fear-based stuff that can that Saturn can bring up in us, depending on Saturn's placement in the chart, house aspects, etc. So, and also, you know, when we're having certain Saturn transits, it brings up a lot of fears within us. It's that fear of failure. It's a very intense psychological experience that feels as real as this glass of water here is. So it's very powerful. Okay, now, with regards to where Saturn is at the moment, just a couple of other points on Saturn, Saturn's energy and transits, because we're really going to be looking at that when we're talking about Saturn in Capricorn over the next 2.5 years anyway. So one really common experience, which is not pleasant, but it's a very common experience. I work in the mental health field, so I speak to a lot of people who go through this or have gone through it or whatever. Depression. So when you think of depression, think of Saturn. It's like Saturn gives birth to depression. Why? Because Saturn's energy can be so hard, cruel, cold, separating. So when you're having some really prominent Saturn transits, you know, say you had, just to give you an example, say you had transiting Saturn conjunct your moon. That's a really tough transit emotionally. That can make one really withdraw from everything, really, emotionally. It can create problems with the relationship with you and your mother. It can create problems with the relationships you have with women, because the moon is the mother and it's also women. So put Saturn there, it's a really hard energy. So I've seen when Saturn goes over the ascendant, when Saturn conjuncts Mercury, when Saturn conjuncts the Sun, when Saturn conjuncts the Moon, and when Saturn conjuncts Venus, and even Mars for that matter, so all the inner planets, you could say, depression is something that comes through very strongly for people. So it's a sense of isolation, separation, withdrawal, feeling unsupported in life. If we think about feeling loved, blessed, supported, guided, and so forth, that's Jupiter. That's what Jupiter brings up for us. Thank God we have the experience of both. But if you think about loneliness, separation, feeling deprived from the abundance of life, universe, your own life, feeling limited, restricted, blocked, not understood, pushed away, that's all Saturn stuff, okay? So that's what Saturn's going to bring up when it's transiting through your chart and hitting certain planets. But, you know, we must also remember that within that process there's tremendous growth, development of your life that is taking place. So we need to have the bitter and the sweet to understand what the bitter is, or to appreciate what the sweet is. So there's, you know, we live in a world of duality. We can't just have bliss 24/7. Even if you were taking some kind of substance which kept you at that blissful state, well, how long could you do that before your body just shuts down and says, well, can't do that anymore? So everything has a limit, and this is what Saturn does. It brings in those limitations, and from a positive level, you know, Saturn will give you the warnings of the limits that you need to pay attention to, because you're overdoing it with something. Now, overdoing it is Jupiter, because Jupiter is all expansive. There's no boundaries. It's over the top. It's, you know, it's everything. It's larger than life. So if you're really Jupiterian, you everything is at, you know, extremes, right? And it's at the excess of everything. Saturn is it is the opposite to that. So it's limitations, restrictions, order. It's being methodical. It's being really tight with money. It's limitations, right? So it's a restructure of all those things. All right, yeah, we're on 39 minutes and I haven't even talked about Saturn in Capricorn. So look, I think, you know, in short, what you need to do is this. When Saturn is going to go into Capricorn very, very soon, in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be there for 2.5 years. It is in Capricorn, so the last time it was in Capricorn was in, when was it? 1988, right? nearly 30 years ago. So, Saturn is having his own return. He's going back into his own natural domain, where he's most comfortable and where he's most successful on that achievement level. So this is great in that sense, in terms of what it can produce collectively. Saturn in Capricorn is incredibly powerful. A lot of great things can happen on that external collective level. I'm not going to talk about that because I'd need to do another video. So I want to just try and stick to what I think you need to be looking at for yourself. Is, yes, Saturn in Capricorn is great, it's strong, it can produce a lot of results, it can be very successful, there's a lot of drive, ambition, there's vision for, you know, for the future, being created in a particular way. It's tuning into all of that. There's, you know, the energy is very strong to put things into place that will blend, that will work, you will feel enabled and supported to create those fundamental structures in your life, whatever they are at this point in life for you. However, the key factor is this: you need to look at, where is Capricorn in your birth chart? Is it in your second house? Is it in your first house? Is it in your 12th house? And where is Saturn in your chart as well? Okay, so the Saturn in Capricorn energy, as I said, it is all those things that I mentioned. So the next 2.5 years, you know, is a great time to really build certain foundations and structures in your life. And perhaps you've been doing that for quite some time, and the Saturn in Capricorn will help culminate this and just bring it all together. It'll be the glue, if you like. Love is the glue to everything, but in terms of what we're talking about here, in structure, 3D reality,